I'm Natalie Alexander. Welcome to AI and Multilateralism, a playlist at the UN Library and Archives Geneva, where we're joined by experts who help us unpack the many ideas at the nexus of AI and international cooperation. Today, we're joined by Emily Tucker, Executive Director at the Center on Privacy and Technology, and also Adjunct Professor of Law at Georgetown Law. There's a lot of talk today on Redlines for AI, but what about Redlines for data? We explore Emily's work and research on what's called Datafication. She shares what this means, the impact of Datafication on political participation and the public interest, and also what this means for our collective capacity to create the futures we want as communities and societies. She shares her views on what kinds of data redlines we need and what multilateral fora should be asking when it comes to how data is collected and used in today's world. Welcome, Emily. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start firstly with your work at the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law, where you're executive director. The center's work is focused on privacy, on surveillance law and policy, but also the communities that these issues affect. And what's interesting is that in 2022, the center stopped using the terms artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning in its work and its institutional vocabulary. Can you tell us why?
Sure. So there are several reasons, but I think there are two that are the most important. The first is just about preserving the meaning of words like intelligence and learning for the thinking that we might want to do about what those terms mean when they refer to human capacities. Those are human intelligence and human learning are mysterious and important things that we don't fully understand. And so keeping them as kind of an area of sacred inquiry, that was important to us. But the much simpler reason, and the reason that maybe a larger proportion of your audience will be able to identify with and appreciate, is that the way that these terms, artificial intelligence, AI, machine learning, are being used right now is not for communication. That's not the purpose. They're being used for obfuscation. That is, they're being used to block rather than enable certain kinds of understanding and inquiry. So the term AI is being slapped on every imaginable form of data product. So technologies that examine how cancer cells evolve is being called AI, and technologies that drive movie recommendations for our streaming apps is being called AI. And so it's not meaningful. It's too broad to be meaningful. It's essentially a marketing term. And so we wanted to just sort of make a commitment not to use the terminology, not as a taboo, not even as a political statement, although I think there is political content to the decision, but really just as a disciplinary practice, as to force ourselves to ask, what is the technology we're really talking about, and who is selling it? How is it actually being used? What are its real effects?
And in the context of the center's work, how do you define these terminologies then? What terms do you use?
So it's not like we find new terms to replace the terms that we're not using. Instead of doing that, every time we are tempted to use, for example, the term artificial intelligence, we will instead ask ourselves, what is the technology actually? So instead of saying like face recognition trained on artificial intelligence, we'll say something like, tech companies are using massive data sets to create algorithms that can match images of human faces. That forces us to really understand what we're talking about, and it allows our reader to really understand and imagine what we're talking about. If we just say AI, it seems like some kind of a magic wand is waved. And that actually removes the agency of the reader as a thinker about the problem. So in addition to being very specific about the technology, we also identify any obstacles to our own understanding of what the technology is. Because a lot of times when you try to find out what is meant by AI in a given instance, you can't get very far because oftentimes the details of the technology are hidden behind claims of trade secrets or other IP smokescreens. But we do also always try to name the corporations that are responsible for creating the technologies and attribute agency to the human beings using the technologies rather than to the technologies themselves.
Right. So instead of just blanket AI, which is such a vague and enormous term, really identifying what are the technologies we're talking about, who do they affect, and why.
Yeah.
I want to look especially at an article you've released recently on data, and that's a big part of your work at the center and your own research. And in a recent article, you argue that to have democracy, we need red lines for data. And before we get to the red lines aspect, I wanted to kind of firstly look at what does data mean in this context and just in our world today, because again, we hear the word data all the time.
Mm-hmm. So I'd actually like to talk not about data, but about datafication, because I think that's what's really relevant here. So the term datafication, different scholars have sort of used it and developed it in different ways. But I think the article that is most helpful for understanding what it really means for most people in our world was written by Ulysses Mejias and Nick Couldry. And the way that they define it, and it isn't an exact quote, but that the term datafication refers to the quantification of human life through digital information, which is rendered as a new form of economic value. So that's a little bit wordy, but basically datafication is turning data into a new form of economic value. And that's really important, that it's not a new thing that has value, but it's a new form of value. So under the datafication regime, economic value is produced, right? Like meaning that certain people are making a lot of money from it. But that economic value is for the most part not deriving from or connected to other forms of value. So social, political, cultural value. So like to make an analogy, imagine we have $1 million US, like physical US dollars. And instead of taking those dollars to a store to buy food or buy clothing or buy books or see a movie or to start a business selling food or clothes or publishing books or producing movies, we take those dollars and we use them to literally construct a machine that prints more money. And then we sell the dollars from our money-making machine for a profit to someone else who uses them to build their own money-making machine, maybe a slightly smaller one than ours, and so on down the chain. That's basically what datafication does. And the data market is not a healthy market because it produces no economic diversity on the one hand and extreme economic disparity on the other. It only works if people are divided into two categories: people who extract data and sell data products, and the people whose data is taken from them and used to control them. And the gap in wealth and power between those two categories right now is big enough that if you're a young person coming of age today, trying to figure out how you're going to make your way in the world, it really feels like your only choice if you want to survive is to get yourself into that first category. So it's kind of a cartoon monster version of the extractivist forms of capitalism that we've been purifying over the last few generations in the West. And we're so used to the datafied world that it's hard to see that digitization is not the same as datafication, right? Like there's no reason we couldn't have digital data and use it to help us do the good and important fun things that we want to do. But what's happening is the opposite. The good and important and fun things we do are being used for datafication, and they're being reshaped by datafication so that the meaning they once had for us is flattened or brutalized or taken out. And the only meaning it has is data production.
Could you walk us through then how much this is impacting our world today, the datafication? We see these big corporations who have so much power now over data and how it's used. How much is this impacting our everyday lives that we just perhaps don't even know about?
Yeah, so a lot. The answer is a lot. And I mean, I think if the basic thing to understand is that everything that you do in the world, whether you do it online or you just do it while carrying your smartphone, or even, the interactions you have with government bureaucracy, that are there to help meet basic needs and provide essential services, all of that is being recorded. And I don't think that most people, when they're walking around, when they're going to the DMV to renew their driver's license, are thinking, oh, and now this form that I'm filling out will be uploaded into a computer, shared through a network, sold to a data broker, repurposed into a data product that will then be used by government and corporate actors to surveil and control me. That's not what people are thinking. And it sounds crazy if you say it, but that is literally what is happening right now.
Yeah. And would you say, knowing that the center's work is also focused on what's happening locally, also in the United States, but would you say that this is something that is happening everywhere now, just by nature of how we live and how data is just used in every aspect of our lives?
Yes, I do think it's happening everywhere. And that is partly due to the centrality of data in mediating all of our everyday forms of life. But it is also due to the nature of tech corporations, that they are global, that they wield incredible power, political power and economic power within specific jurisdictions, but also over the global political ecosystem. But I do just want to, with the caveat that it's very different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I think there are a lot of similarities in how tech companies wield their power. If you look at, say, for example, North America and Europe, there's a lot of similarities because there are a lot of economic similarities and political similarities. The way that it shows up, the way that people experience the wealth and power aggregation of tech companies and the way data is used will be very different in other places that have so in the global South, in African countries, in countries in South America, it may be very different because of the different political forms. So I am not, I think the details really, really matter. And I certainly can't speak with authority about how that is showing up in other political contexts where I'm not on the ground.
Yeah. I want to now look a bit more at Redlines for data, because it's a really fascinating article that you wrote. And we see across policy at the international level, you also mentioned in your article, the big calls for AI redlines, essentially these boundaries that AI systems must not cross. You argue, though, that AI redlines might not be as helpful as we think if we don't also have data redlines. Why is that?
So if you are talking about regulating AI, you're talking about regulating the data product, which means you're presuming the data product can and will exist, which means you're conceding that all of the data practices that go into the creation of the product will continue. The corporate data practices that underlie the products that are being marketed as AI are practices of power and wealth aggregation. And so if you're saying, go ahead and make those products that depend on mass quantities of surveillance data, that depend on you having access to essentially unlimited resources in order to process that data, that depend on you being able to market your data products to governments so that whole industries that are supposed to serve the public interest, like education and healthcare, transportation, become dependent on your intellectual property and your continued access to endless quantities of that data. It doesn't matter what you write on paper because you're beholden to those corporations and you're dependent on the data practices. And so you can say, oh, well, you can do all of these things, but then if you want to use the AI to do killing in a military context, to do targeted killing in a military context, we're going to impose some restrictions. I don't know why you think you're going to have the political power as a practical matter to enforce that, or even to oversee it, even to understand how it is happening. So that's the main reason.
And do we see in any kind of political or government context today action in actually making data redlines, or is this something that's just not happening?
As far as I know, it's barely happening. I mean, the best examples that I see are happening at the municipal level. So not even at the state, in the US anyway, not even at the state level. Yeah. I see that in the US, there are some localities that are trying to put some limits on the data broker industry. So the extent to which data can be bought and sold and for what purposes it can be bought and sold. And there are some exciting efforts to impose limits on what can happen with the data that the government bureaucracy creates in order to deliver essential services. But this problem can't be solved solely at the local level. Like we are going to need some kind of international action in order to make a dent, just because the situation is already so far gone and the power concentration is already so extreme. So I think that the best examples are at the local level, but those examples need to be massively scaled up.
Yeah, I'm very interested to hear more about your thoughts on the international level in a moment. But just to finish off on discussing a bit more the risks of not having data redlines, on the current trajectory, what kind of future are you facing for our ability to dictate our futures if these public infrastructures, like you say, are underpinned by data that's run and led by these corporations?
Yeah, I think it's pretty bleak. And there are a lot of different ways to understand that bleakness, but I think the most important one is the relationship between datafication and corporate wealth and power aggregation and surveillance. So one of the reasons that their control is so durable is because surveillance is such a powerful deterrent to political deliberation. Surveillance makes engaging in the day-to-day activities of political self-determination very difficult and very risky. And so that is really their long-term business plan, is to just so disempower the citizenry. And I don't mean that citizenry I mean that in the Rousseauian sense, not in like a technocratic sense, not who has papers, right? But the members of the political community, to disempower them as deliberators about fundamental questions about who are we, how do we want to live together, and what are we going to do to try to make that shared vision that we have possible. That's just very, very difficult to do in the context of mass surveillance. And so I'm worried about other things too. I'm worried about, how will we have economic liberty when a handful of tech executives control the organization and allocation of capital, right? But how we have freedom of speech when we have, in the United States, the Supreme Court basically converting individual speech rights or suppressing individual speech rights in favor of corporate speech rights. But I think the much bigger problem is the more fundamental problem of how do you be a functioning political community in a context of where you are comprehensively watched by a malign surveiller.
I want to look a bit more then about how we can make data redlines happen in kind of the wider context of AI governance in general, because we see all around us at the local level, like you mentioned, but also national levels, international levels, a lot of different initiatives with regard to AI governance, frameworks, initiatives, thousands actually of soft governance kind of frameworks related to AI in general. But in terms of data redlines, you call for 3 specific categories or ways that we can implement data redlines. Could you briefly walk us through these and what they mean in practice?
Sure. And I should say that, these are the things that come to mind for me. But what I really think is most needed is people to get together and think about this problem. And so these are the categories that seem most glaring. I don't think we get very far without reaching these 3 categories, but I'm not 100% sure that they're comprehensive. There may be things that I'm missing. But the things that seem crucial to me are, we need red lines that put limits on who can create and collect what kinds of data and for what purposes. And so that needs to include limitations on data production and aggregation that are specifically for-profit corporations and also specifically for governments. And maybe those limitations look different for those different parties. But I think that as part of that, there need to be presumptions against any kind of digital data creation when it comes to certain categories of very sensitive data. So things like health data or data relating to political speech, location data is an extremely sensitive form of data. So we just need really, really strong restrictions around the creation and collection of data in the first place. And then I think we need red lines. This sounds kind of like a blunt instrument, but I think it's necessary. We need red lines limiting the amounts of data that can be amassed by any individual or entity. So just an individual piece of digital data is not going to be a big problem in most cases. I mean, I guess it can be used against an individual wrongly in a criminal prosecution or something. But the problem is really when you have these massive amounts of data that amount to that change the sort of political and economic gravity of in a particular context. So we need limitations on the amount. And then, so related to that is also limiting the amount of resources that can be consumed in processing data. So it's just so egregious that corporations have been allowed to expend natural resources under another term that I find really problematic in addition to AI and artificial intelligence is the term compute. Compute makes it sounds like something very sci-fi, something very sophisticated and advanced that no one could question, but it's just energy, it's just resources. And so we need limits on how many of our non-renewable natural resources can be expended for data processing. And I think we also need red lines around the dependencies that I was talking about earlier. So when there are proprietary data products being used in systems that are crucial to the public interest, like healthcare, like education, like media, like transportation, we need to be sure that those products are not used in a way that creates a dependency on the product, so that the control over how those products are used in those systems is maintained by the political community and not by the corporation.
There's one question I wanted to ask you, and that is a little bit about the work of the UN, because you may have seen that there's been an AI high-level panel looking at how we can govern AI internationally. Last year, the General Assembly adopted a resolution to enact a global AI dialogue once a year, and also an independent international scientific panel on AI. So two bodies with different purposes. I wonder, what is something that you would urge these bodies to take into consideration, not just about governance of AI, but about data?
I think it's just sort of what I've already said, to consider datafication, right? Like the narrative around the digital is the narrative of the inevitable. That we have to find a way to move forward, accepting that this is the state of affairs. And I feel like that's what all of these dialogues, including the ones being facilitated by the UN, that's kind of what the premise has been, that this is sort of a fact on the ground, or even almost a force of nature. And so we have to do something to try to direct it towards the good, but there's nothing we can do about it as a phenomenon. And I really think it's a mistake to think about the digital, or certainly the datafied digital world, as being on the arc of human progress. I think it's sort of this toxic tributary we stumbled into, and we have to find our way out of it before we're going to be able to find a way forward. And so I think for bodies like the UN that have a positive social purpose and a positive political mission, the question on the table has to be, how do we undo datafication? How do we undo the infrastructure? Not how do we direct the infrastructure towards the good? Because what's baked into the infrastructure is the disempowerment of political communities.
Coming back then to those examples at the municipal level, where you're seeing some action on how data is used, how can we make this happen then at the government and more global level? So what will it take?
So this is the part that's hard, because who's the we in your question, right? Yeah. Who is in charge of this? And I did say earlier that there needs to be international action, and that without it, we're kind of lost. But I don't think that right now, with the way that with our current geopolitical construct, that it's going to happen by a handful of leaders saying, okay, Emily Tucker wrote a piece in Tech Policy Press, and now we're going to do her 3-point plan. That's not going to happen because of how far gone all of this infrastructure is. What is going to have to happen is a groundswell, and it's not going to be, a 10-point plan that can be imposed, right? It is going to be communities deciding, you know what, we don't want this. This isn't actually our vision of a good future for ourselves or our kids or our grandkids or our community. And we want to undo some of this. We want to do what is necessary to take back some of our political, economic power. And that is going to look really different from community to community, not just from country to country, but even just, I support grassroots groups in the US that are working to pass legislation at the state level, at the city level. What works in Illinois and Chicago is totally different from what works in Maryland and California and New Jersey, not just because of the legal frameworks being different, but because the communities are different and the impacts on them are different, and the things that will galvanize them to organize together are different. So what we really need is a massive global project where civil society says, no, we are in charge of making meaning. The companies, the tech companies, and the governments that are complicit with the tech companies are not in charge of making political meaning and social meaning and cultural meaning. And what do we need to do right here where we are in this local community to demand that we are able to do that again? And that is, I think, going to involve undoing some of the digital infrastructure. So simply just saying all of the things that have allowed datafication, which, as I'd sort of defined and explained it at the top of this podcast, that have allowed datafication to be embedded in everything that we do. We have to just figure out how to slowly take that apart piece by piece. And I don't think it's like a trajectory that anyone can paint from beginning to end right now. I think it's going to be, a generations long process that we're going to have to kind of it's going to be improvisational. It's going to be a struggle. And we're going to have to kind of work to make our local struggles fit together with one another. We're going to have to do that work to connect across geographies, across jurisdictions, to learn from one another and to build on one another's work.
And looking at the angle of grassroots and how our communities are different, but how we can piece them together and see our common issues. What do you think about multilateralism and the state of multilateralism? Is there a way to ensure that civil society has a much more integral place in a multilateralism of the future? Our current kind of structures around multilateralism require and are focused on mostly states, nation states being members. And civil society is part of that and is consulted. But do you think there's room for different structures to make sure that, as you said, this really local level civil society grassroots movement to how we see data can be uplifted at a more international level?
So what I hear in your question, and maybe this isn't what you're asking, is like, are there systems that we could create where civil society as one thing and government policymakers as another thing could interact more productively, where the role of civil society? But that to me that assumes that the people creating those processes for engagement are the policy people, right? It's that they're the ones that have to open up the space. And I just don't think they're going to do that. And I think what is really necessary, and if you look at history, this is the way it works, is the people who already have institutional power have to be forced. They have to feel pressure. They have to feel the demand. And one of the problems in the US right now, and I think this is true in various places in Europe as well, is that we have very statist forms of democracy, and the practices of citizenship that we're used to are somewhat disengaged, right? We vote, and maybe we have some kind of local political formations that we participate in, but we don't have robust practices of thinking this problem is our problem and turning towards each other, right? We have practices of looking towards the government and saying, what are you going to do to fix this? And so I think that I do wish I wish that I could right now come up with, here would be a way for civil society to actually have power and actually have say and actually have sway and actually have, their creative imagination to be part of the process of figuring out data governance. But I don't think that we are in a world where the people who have power are going to agree to do that, because institutional actors just don't give up power easily. And so I think it is going to need to be adversarial, unfortunately. I think it is going to need to be that the people who have the power feel their power is under threat unless they do some of the things that the political communities they're supposed to serve have said must happen. And we have to get to that first step of the political community saying, this is what must happen. And we're just still at the very, very beginning of figuring out how to do that.
On that point, for our listeners who are saying, okay, this seems like a big mountain, and like you said, it's going to be generations and generations, but we have to start somewhere. But I want to understand more about how our data is impacting our lives and our futures. What's one thing they could do to start on that process?
One thing that they could do is start finding out what is the state of local data governance law. And that might also mean finding out what is the state of national data governance law. So just undertaking a project, and I recommend doing this not alone, but with other people that you are in some other community forum with. So I really love to suggest this to students because they are the ones that are going to be left to clean up this mess. Come together in a group and try to understand what happens to the different types of data that belong to you. What happens to you, the data that is generated about you as you walk around with a smartphone in your pocket that has location tracking, or with apps that have location tracking enabled. Just try to trace that, try to understand who are all of the actors that benefit from that automatic data collection that's happening, and understand how it shows up in political processes, how it shows up in economic processes. Understand what power you have to start to claw that back. And then pick one thing that you don't like about what is done with your data, and organize against it. And that could be something as simple as, so actually today I'm releasing an open letter that I wrote to the students of Georgetown, which is where I work, urging them to resist the decision by Georgetown to integrate so-called AI into all of the university's curriculums and administrative practices, and urging them to just engage in a project of resisting that. And so it doesn't even have to be something that's targeted towards your city council or your state government or your national legislature. It can just be something that is directed to your school or or your faith organization. I'm increasingly hearing about churches that are using surveillance devices, data collection devices to supposedly understand the needs of the congregation. Choose one use of your data that you don't like and organize with other people to resist it. And the point of this is not the outcome, right? It's not whether you win. It's the activity of citizenship that you are engaging in and the education that you are doing together with your community members in order to engage in that active resistance and to develop a resistance practice.
What is one helpful open access resource? If listeners are like, this is the start of something much more interesting for me, where can they go to learn more?
Okay, it's very hard to choose one thing, but I really love this
question. You can say more than one, but
Okay, so the one that if the kinds of things that I've been saying, or if people are thinking, oh, this is really interesting, the one place, obviously you can look at the work of the Privacy Center. All of our stuff is free and online, and I encourage you to do that. But I would direct people to the work of the Distributed Artificial Intelligence Research Institute, DARE, which is run by Timnit Gebru, who was fired from Google for trying to tell the truth. And they do incredible work, and they publish reports, they do zines, they host this initiative called the Data Workers Inquiry, where data workers themselves research the data practices of the companies that are employing them. And I mean, all of the research that they put out is incredible, and the content is amazing. There's so much to learn from. But what I really want to ask people to focus on is the work of DARE as an example, right? That's the kind of work we need. Their work is participatory. No community is excluded from knowledge creation in their model of research and their model of communication. And so anybody, look at what's on DARE's website. Anybody can do that kind of research, and everybody should.
Emily Tucker, thank you so much for your time, for sharing all your knowledge. We'll make sure to have the links that you mentioned, as well as the link to the article that you wrote for Tech Policy Press. I wish you all the best as you continue your work.
Thank you so much for having me.